The child was 3 days old when they came for him. His mother's name was Agoge. She was 20 years old, the wife of a Spartan soldier stationed on the northern frontier, and she had carried this baby for 9 months through a summer so hot that the Eurotas River dropped to half its depth, and the olive groves on the slopes of Taygetus turned brown in the heat. She had endured the labor alone, as Spartan women were expected to, without midwives from outside the city, without herbs for the pain, without crying out, because a woman who screamed during childbirth revealed weakness. And weakness in Sparta was not a private failing. It was a public crime. She had done everything right. She had exercised through her pregnancy as the laws demanded, running and wrestling with other women in the gymnasium until her belly made it impossible. She had eaten the black broth, the blood and vinegar soup that every Spartan consumed regardless of preference, because individual taste was irrelevant in a society where even meals were collective acts of discipline. She had prayed at the temple of Artemis for a son, because sons were the only currency that mattered in Sparta, the only product a woman could deliver that would secure her position, her reputation, her right to be remembered after death with an inscribed tombstone rather than an unmarked grave. And she had produced a son, a boy, alive, breathing, with strong lungs and dark eyes. For 3 days she held him, she fed him, she studied his face in the lamplight, and allowed herself, in the privacy of those stone walls, to feel something that Sparta considered dangerous. She allowed herself to love him. On the 3rd day, the elders arrived. 2 men from the Gerousia, the council that governed Sparta alongside its 2 kings. They did not knock. They entered as representatives of the state, which owned everything within the borders of Laconia, including the bodies of its citizens, including the body of a boy who had not yet been given a name. Because in Sparta you did not name a child until the state confirmed he was worth naming. They unwrapped him from his cloth. They held him in the light from the narrow window. They stretched his legs. They tested the grip of his fingers. They listened to the strength of his cry. They turned him and examined his spine, his hips, the alignment of his limbs. Agiates stood against the far wall and watched. She could not intervene. She could not speak unless addressed. She could not reach for her own child because in this moment he was not her child. He was material being evaluated for its usefulness to the state. One of the elders paused. He held the boy's left leg and rotated the foot slowly. He looked at his colleague. Something passed between them, a judgment that took less than a second, but that would define the remaining decades of this woman's life. The foot did not straighten fully. The ankle turned inward, at an angle that might have been imperceptible to anyone not trained to spot deviation from physical perfection. But these men were trained. Their entire function was to identify deviation. And in Sparta, deviation was not treated. It was removed. He spoke a single word to Agiates, a word that every Spartan mother dreaded in the silence of those 3 days between birth and inspection. Unfit. The child would be taken to the apothetae, the deposits. A chasm on the slopes of Mount Taygetus, the mountain that loomed over Sparta like a permanent reminder that nature was as indifferent to human life as the state was. A place where things the city did not want were discarded. Agiates could not follow them. She could not weep in their presence. She could not ask to hold her son one more time. Because in Sparta, a mother who mourned a rejected child was making a declaration. She was saying that her love for one infant mattered more than the strength of the collective, that her private grief outweighed the public good, that she presumed to question the judgment of elders who had maintained Spartan supremacy for centuries, and that declaration was itself a punishable offense. Women had been publicly humiliated for less. Women had been stripped of their status, their property, their place in the social order for showing attachment to children the state had deemed unworthy. So Agiatus stood in silence as they carried her unnamed son out of her home and into the morning light. She watched them walk the path toward the mountain. She listened until she could no longer hear the baby's cries over the sound of wind moving through the valley. And then she was alone, in a house that smelled of birth and milk, with empty arms and a grief she was forbidden to express, in a city that called itself the greatest civilization in Greece. But before I tell you what happened at the base of that mountain, before I reveal what archaeologists discovered centuries later in that chasm, a discovery that rewrote everything historians thought they knew about this practice, I need to take you back. I need to show you how Sparta built the most complete system of human control the ancient world ever produced. A system where punishment was not something that happened when you broke the rules. Punishment was the foundation the rules were built on. Every Spartan from birth to death lived inside a machinery of discipline so total that even other Greeks, people who practiced slavery and warfare and exposed their own infants, looked at Sparta and called it excessive. And I need to show you what they did to their women. Because the story you think you know about Spartan women, the empowered females who owned property and spoke freely and told their sons to come home with their shields or on them, that story is a myth built on a half-truth. The reality is that Spartan women were not liberated. They were optimized, engineered for a single function, punished when they failed to perform it, and discarded when they were no longer useful. What you are about to learn will dismantle everything you thought you knew about the most militarized society in ancient history. If you want to understand how a civilization can perfect the art of controlling human beings through punishment so constant it becomes invisible, how a system can disguise oppression as honor and call cruelty a tradition, then you need to watch this entire video. Subscribe to this channel right now because what I am about to reveal goes far beyond the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what you think you know about Sparta because I guarantee this story will shatter every assumption. And make sure you watch all the way to the end because the discovery at the base of Mount Taygetus changes everything. To understand why Sparta punished its own people more harshly than it punished its enemies, you need to understand the single fear that drove every decision the city ever made. Sparta was terrified, not of Persia, not of Athens, not of any foreign army. Sparta was terrified of the people living inside its own borders. The Spartans ruled a region called Laconia in the southeastern corner of the Peloponnese. It was fertile land, rich soil fed by the Eurotas River, surrounded by mountains that created a natural fortress. But the Spartans had not always owned this land. They had taken it. Centuries before the classical era that produced Thermopylae and Leonidas, the Spartans conquered the neighboring region of Messenia and enslaved its entire population. These enslaved people were called helots. They worked the fields, harvested the crops, maintained the infrastructure, and produced everything that allowed Spartan citizens to spend their entire lives training for war. The problem was numbers. The historian Herodotus estimated that helots outnumbered Spartans by roughly 7-1. Some modern scholars put the ratio even higher, perhaps 10-1. Sparta was a small military elite, sitting on top of a massive enslaved population that hated them, that remembered their own freedom, that passed stories of their lost homeland from generation to generation, and that revolted whenever they sensed weakness. The Helot revolt of approximately 464 before the Common Era shook Sparta so badly that the aftershocks shaped policy for the next 2 centuries. Every institution Sparta built, every law it passed, every punishment it designed, was reverse-engineered from one question: how do we prevent the helots from destroying us? The answer was total militarization. Every male Spartan citizen would be a professional soldier from age 7 until age 60. No exceptions, no alternatives. No Spartan man would farm or trade or practice a craft. The helots would do all of that. Spartans would only fight. And to produce soldiers of sufficient quality, every aspect of Spartan life would be controlled, monitored, and enforced through a punishment system so pervasive that obedience became reflexive rather than chosen. The ancient sources attribute this system to a single lawgiver named Lycurgus, who supposedly redesigned Spartan society in a single act of revolutionary reform. Whether Lycurgus was a real person or a mythical figure onto whom centuries of gradual change were projected remains debated. What is not debated is the result. Sparta became a society where the state owned its citizens the way other states owned livestock. Plutarch, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, described it plainly. In Sparta, no man was permitted to live as he pleased. The city was like a military camp where every person had a fixed role, a fixed schedule, and a fixed understanding that deviation meant punishment. The geography reinforced the psychology. Sparta sat in a valley between two mountain ranges. To the west, the Taygetus Range rose over 7,000 feet, its peaks visible from every corner of the city. This was the mountain where rejected infants were taken, where criminals were thrown from cliffs, where young men were sent during their training to survive alone in the wilderness. Taygetus was not just geography. It was a symbol. It loomed over every Spartan life as a reminder that the state could send you up that mountain at any time and that you might not come back down. To the east, the lower Parnan Range completed the enclosure. Sparta had no defensive walls. The lawgiver Lycurgus supposedly forbade them, declaring that a city defended by men needed no defensive stone. Later writers celebrated this as supreme confidence, but there was another reading. A city without walls is a city you cannot hide inside. There is no barrier between private life and public scrutiny. There is nowhere to go that the state cannot see you. The absence of walls was not confidence. It was control. This was the world Agiatis was born into, a world where the mountain was always watching, where punishment was not something that happened to criminals, but something that happened to everyone, constantly, as the baseline condition of existence. And it began before you could walk, before you could speak, before you had a name. The inspection of newborns was not a ritual performed in secret. It was law. Plutarch describes it in his Life of Lycurgus with the detachment of a man documenting agricultural practice. The father of a newborn child did not have the right to raise it. He carried it to a place called the Lesche, a public hall where the eldest members of the tribe examined the infant. If it was well built and sturdy, they assigned it to one of the 9,000 land allotments that supported Spartan citizens. If it was poorly born or deformed, they sent it to the Apothete, a chasm near Mount Taygetus, believing that the life of that which nature had not equipped from the start for health and strength was of no advantage to itself or to the state. The language is important, not of advantage to itself. The Spartans did not frame this as cruelty. They framed it as mercy. A child born imperfect would suffer in a society that demanded physical perfection from every citizen. Better to end that suffering immediately than to allow it to compound across a lifetime of inadequacy. This logic, repeated across centuries, became so embedded in Spartan identity that questioning it was unthinkable. You might as well question gravity. But what actually happened at the Apothete? For centuries, historians assumed they knew. Infants were thrown into the chasm and left to die on the rocks below. The image became iconic, a shorthand for Spartan brutality, repeated in textbooks and films and popular histories without much examination. Then, in the early 2000s, archaeologists conducted a systematic survey of the Cowardice chasm on the western slope of Taygetus, the site most scholars identified as the Apothete. They found bones, hundreds of them, but something was wrong with the picture. The bones were overwhelmingly adult, male adults. Dating analysis placed them across several centuries, consistent with the classical and Hellenistic periods of Spartan history. The skeletal evidence showed trauma consistent with falling from great height, confirming that people were indeed thrown into this chasm. But they were not infants. They were grown men, prisoners, criminals, enemies. The cowardice chasm appeared to be an execution site, not a nursery graveyard. This discovery did not mean that Spartan infant inspection was a myth. The literary sources are too consistent and too numerous to dismiss. What it suggested was that rejected infants may not have been thrown into a pit at all. They may have faced something different: exposure, abandonment on the mountainside or in the wilderness outside the city, left to die of cold and hunger and thirst over hours or days, rather than killed instantly by impact. Some scholars believe rejected infants were left at crossroads or near neighboring settlements where non-Spartans might find them and raise them as helots or perioikoi, the free non-citizens who occupied the margins of Spartan society. The child did not die in a moment of violence. The child died slowly, or survived into a life of servitude that Sparta considered worse than death. For Agoge, the distinction would have meant nothing. Whether her son died on rocks, or died alone in the cold, or grew up enslaved to the state that rejected him, the result was the same. He was gone. She would never hold him again. She would never know what happened to him. And she was forbidden from asking. The inspection at birth was only the beginning. If a child passed, if the elders judged him strong enough and straight enough and loud enough to deserve a place in Sparta, he was granted 7 years with his mother. 7 years of something that in any other Greek city would have been called childhood. In Sparta, it was a temporary delay before the real process began. At age 7, boys were taken from their homes and entered the Agoge. The word itself means guidance or training, which makes it sound educational. It was not educational. It was a system designed to destroy the individual and replace him with a soldier. The boy who entered the Agoge at 7 would not return to civilian life until he was 30 years old. 23 years of state-controlled existence, during which every aspect of his body, his mind, his emotional responses, and his tolerance for suffering would be shaped by deliberate, calculated, relentless punishment. The boys were organized into groups called herds, not classes, not cohorts, herds. The language was intentional. They were animals being domesticated for a purpose. Each herd was supervised by an older youth called an iron, typically around 20 years old, who had absolute authority over the younger boys, including the right to beat them for any infraction real or invented. Xenophon, an Athenian who admired Sparta and wrote extensively about its customs, described the system with approval that modern readers find chilling. He noted that Lycurgus wanted boys to be governed by the strongest hand rather than the gentlest, ensuring they would never be without someone authorized to punish them. The physical conditions were deliberately brutal. Each boy received a single cloak per year, 1 garment for summer heat and winter cold, no shoes, no underclothing, no blankets. They slept on beds they made themselves from reeds, pulled by hand from the banks of the Eurotas River, snapping the stalks without knives because knives were not permitted. In winter, they were allowed to weave thistledown into the reeds for marginal warmth, marginal being the key word. The cold was not an oversight, it was curriculum. Discomfort taught endurance. Suffering taught silence. Deprivation taught the body to function on less than any enemy could take away. Food was restricted by design. The boys were fed just enough to survive, but never enough to feel full. Plutarch explains the reasoning with disturbing clarity. Lycurgus believed that bodies kept lean and hungry would grow taller and healthier than bodies that were fed to satisfaction, and that hunger would teach resourcefulness because the boys would be forced to steal food to supplement their rations. The stealing was not merely tolerated, it was required. Boys who failed to steal were punished for lacking initiative, but boys who were caught stealing were punished far more severely, not for the theft itself, but for the incompetence of being detected. The lesson was precise. Deception is a survival skill. Morality is irrelevant. Only results matter. Get caught, and you deserve what happens to you. The most famous illustration of this principle is the story of the Spartan boy and the fox. A boy stole a live fox and hid it beneath his cloak. When an adult approached and began speaking to him, the boy stood at attention and answered questions calmly, while the fox, trapped against his body, began clawing and biting into his stomach. The boy did not flinch, did not cry out, did not reveal the animal. He maintained perfect composure while the fox tore through his flesh until the boy collapsed and died. When they opened his cloak and found the fox and the destroyed abdomen, the Spartans did not mourn him. They celebrated him. This boy had demonstrated the ultimate Spartan virtue. He had chosen death over the shame of being caught. Plutarch records this story not as tragedy, but as aspiration. This was what the Agoge was designed to produce. Human beings who would rather be eaten alive than admit weakness. But the Agoge did not rely only on cold and hunger and the constant threat of beatings to forge its soldiers. It had a centerpiece, a ritual so violent that it attracted spectators from across the ancient world. A ceremony where Spartan boys were whipped until they collapsed or died while crowds watched and judged their silence. The diamastagosis took place at the altar of Artemis Orthia, one of the oldest and most sacred religious sites in Sparta. The ritual, as described by Plutarch, Xenophon, and later by the Roman orator Cicero, who witnessed it personally, worked like this. Cheese was placed on the altar. Boys were sent to steal it. And as they approached, older youths armed with whips lashed them with full force. The objective was not to prevent the theft. The objective was to measure how much pain a boy could absorb while still completing his task. The whips were not ceremonial. They were designed to break skin. The boys were struck across their backs, their legs, their arms, their faces. Blood ran down the steps of the altar and pooled on the stone. Plutarch records that boys died under the lash, not occasionally, regularly enough that he mentions it without surprise, the way a writer might note that some runners collapse during a race. He describes boys who endured the whipping with such complete stillness that observers could not tell whether they were conscious or had passed out on their feet. Cicero, who traveled to Sparta specifically to observe the ritual, confirmed what the Greek sources described. He wrote that he saw boys being torn apart by blows without uttering a single sound, not a groan, not a gasp, nothing. He called it extraordinary. He also called it horrifying, though he added that qualification almost as an afterthought. The audience was essential. This was not a private test conducted in a training yard. This was public spectacle. Families attended. Mothers and fathers watched their sons being whipped and evaluated not the cruelty of the punishment, but the quality of their child's endurance. A boy who cried out shamed his family. A boy who collapsed too quickly marked himself as inferior. A boy who died silently under the whips was honored as the highest expression of Spartan values. The spectators were not passive. They shouted encouragement, not to the boys, but to the whippers. Harder, faster, do not show mercy. Mercy defeated the purpose. Foreign visitors began traveling to Sparta specifically to witness the diamastagosis. It became a tourist attraction. Plutarch notes that people came from across Greece to watch, drawn by the same combination of horror and fascination that fills arenas in every era. The Romans, when they later dominated Greece, formalized this tourism. They built a stone amphitheater around the altar of Artemis Orthia, replacing the earthen viewing areas with permanent seating so that larger crowds could watch in comfort while Spartan boys bled on ancient stone. That amphitheater still exists. Archaeologists excavating the site found the altar beneath layers of accumulated sediment. Chemical analysis of the stone revealed iron-rich deposits consistent with centuries of human blood soaking into porous limestone. The altar of Artemis Orthia was not merely stained, it was saturated. Layer upon layer of blood absorbed over generations, each layer representing dozens of boys whipped until their bodies broke, while their parents watched, and their city called it sacred. The message of the Dimastagosis was the message of all Spartan punishment distilled to its purest form. Your body does not belong to you. Your pain is not yours to manage. Your suffering is a public resource that the state will spend however it sees fit. And your only value, the only thing that separates you from the rejected infant on the slopes of Taygetus, is your ability to endure what is done to you without making a sound. This was what Sparta did to the children it chose to keep. Think about what you have heard so far. Infants discarded for a twisted foot. Children starved and frozen as policy. Boys whipped to death as entertainment at a public altar. And every one of these practices was inflicted not on enemies or criminals, but on Spartan citizens. On children the state had already approved. On boys who had passed the inspection at birth and been judged worthy of raising. This was how Sparta treated the people it valued. What do you think it did to the people it considered tools? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what comes next dismantles one of the most persistent myths in all of ancient history. And the truth is far worse than the legend it replaced. You have heard that Spartan women were the most liberated females in the ancient Greek world. You have seen it in documentaries, read it in popular histories, encountered it in films that portray Spartan wives as fierce, independent, outspoken women who held real power while their husbands were away at war. Queen Gorgo telling a foreign visitor that only Spartan women give birth to real men. Mothers handing shields to their sons with the command to come back carrying it or lying on it. Strong women, free women, women unlike any others in the ancient world. There is a grain of truth in this image. Compared to Athenian women who were confined to their homes, forbidden from owning property, excluded from public life, and treated as little more than household furniture, Spartan women did enjoy certain freedoms. They exercised publicly. They owned and inherited property. They spoke in the presence of men without being silenced. They received physical training alongside other women. By the standards of 5th century Greece, these were remarkable privileges. But those privileges were not granted out of respect for women as human beings. They were granted because Sparta needed something from women that it could not obtain through force alone. It needed healthy babies, strong babies, babies that would pass the inspection at the Lesha and survive the Agoge, and become the soldiers that kept the helots enslaved, and the enemies defeated and the system intact. Everything Sparta gave its women was designed to optimize their bodies for reproduction. The exercise was not for their well-being. It was because Spartan officials believed, following theories attributed to Lycurgus himself, that physically active mothers produce stronger offspring. Plutarch states this explicitly. Lycurgus ordered maidens to exercise their bodies in running, wrestling, and throwing the discus, so that the fruit of their wombs would have a strong root in strong bodies and would develop better. The women were not athletes. They were soil being prepared for planting. Property ownership existed because Spartan men were absent for most of their adult lives, either training in the barracks or fighting on campaign. Someone had to manage the land, and the helots who worked it. Giving women property rights was not liberation. It was delegation of economic labor to the only people available to perform it. And the freedom to speak publicly, the famous Spartan female boldness that so shocked other Greeks, served a specific function within the punishment system. Women were not encouraged to speak freely on all topics. They were encouraged to shame men who showed cowardice, to mock men who failed in battle, to publicly humiliate anyone who fell below Spartan standards. Their speech was weaponized. They were given voices not to express themselves, but to enforce the state's values on its male citizens through the most powerful tool available, social destruction delivered by the people whose approval men craved most. The Spartan woman was not free. She was an enforcer who did not know she was also a prisoner. Women who produced daughters instead of sons faced a quieter but no less devastating form of punishment. Daughters were not worthless in Sparta. They would grow up to become mothers themselves, and strong mothers were essential to the system. But a daughter was not a soldier. A daughter did not train in the Agoge. A daughter did not stand in the battle line or defend the state against helot revolt. A woman who produced only daughters had failed to deliver the one product Sparta could not function without. Her status diminished with each female birth. Her husband's patience shortened. The whispers of other women, those weaponized voices the state had so carefully sharpened, turned in her direction. And then there were the mothers of cowards. In a society that punished failure more harshly than it rewarded success, the worst thing a Spartan woman could be was the mother of a man who ran from battle. The sources are filled with stories of Spartan mothers reacting to their sons' cowardice with fury rather than compassion. A mother who learned that her son had fled from the enemy was expected to publicly disown him, to curse him, to declare that she wished he had died rather than live as a disgrace. The most famous of these stories, repeated by Plutarch and others, describes a mother who, upon hearing that her son had survived a battle by retreating, pointed to her own body and said, "The earth should swallow him back into the place he came from." Whether these specific quotes are historical fact or patriotic legend crafted to reinforce Spartan values is debated. What is not debated is the culture they reflect. Spartan women were conditioned to value the state above their children. A mother who wept for a coward son was not showing love. She was showing disloyalty. And disloyalty was punished through the most effective mechanism Sparta possessed. Not physical violence, but social annihilation. The other women would stop speaking to her. She would be excluded from religious ceremonies. Her remaining children would carry the stain of their brother's shame. She would become invisible in a society small enough that invisibility meant complete isolation. No walls to hide behind. No private spaces where shame could be endured in secret. Just the open streets of a city without walls where everyone knew your name and everyone knew what your son had done. This was the trap. Spartan women were given just enough status to have something to lose: property, social standing, the respect of other women, the honor of being a mother of warriors. And then the system threatened to take all of it away unless they performed their function perfectly. Produce strong sons, shame weak men, celebrate death in battle as the highest achievement your child can reach. Never grieve, never hesitate. Never allow your love for your child to outweigh your loyalty to the state. The freedoms Sparta granted its women were not gifts. They were leashes made of gold, beautiful enough to be mistaken for jewelry until you tried to walk in a direction the state had not approved. But if Spartan women were prisoners who enforced their own captivity, there was another class of women in Sparta for whom the word prisoner does not begin to capture the reality. Below the Spartan wives and mothers and daughters, below even the perioikoi women who lived on the margins of Spartan territory with limited rights, but at least nominal freedom, there existed a population of women whose suffering was so fundamental to Sparta's existence that acknowledging it fully would have required the Spartans to admit that their entire civilization was built on a crime: the helot women. The enslaved women who fed Sparta, clothed Sparta, nursed Sparta's children, and endured whatever Sparta chose to inflict on them without legal protection, without recourse, without hope. And the prison began with marriage. The Spartan wedding ritual tells you everything you need to know about how the state viewed women, not as partners, but as objects to be processed through a system designed to strip away identity and replace it with function. The ceremony, if it can be called that, was known as marriage by capture. Plutarch describes it in detail that later historians have struggled to contextualize as anything other than what it plainly was. The bride's head was shaved, completely. Her hair, which in every Greek culture was a primary marker of female identity and beauty, was removed. She was then dressed in a man's cloak and sandals and left alone in a dark room. No lamps, no attendants, no ceremony, no family present. Her new husband, who may have barely spoken to her before this night, would arrive after dining with his messmates in the barracks. He would find her in the darkness. He would do what he came to do. And then he would leave, returning to the barracks before dawn, so that no one would know he had been absent. Plutarch insists this arrangement was designed to build desire through scarcity, to keep the relationship fresh by making contact rare. Modern historians read the same evidence and see something different. They see a system designed to prevent emotional attachment between husband and wife. The shaved head removed the bride's identity. The male clothing confused the boundary between feminine and masculine, conditioning the husband to associate intimacy not with tenderness but with domination. The darkness ensured that the encounter was physical rather than personal. The secrecy ensured that the marriage remained subordinate to the man's primary loyalty, which was not to his wife but to his barracks and his unit. The entire ritual taught both partners the same lesson. This marriage does not belong to you. It belongs to Sparta. You are here to produce soldiers. Everything else is irrelevant. Young couples sometimes went years without seeing each other in daylight. Plutarch records that some men fathered children before they had ever seen their wife's face in full light. The emotional consequences of this are not difficult to imagine. A woman shaved and stripped and left in the dark for a man she barely knew, then left alone for weeks or months at a time, until he returned for another brief encounter in darkness. This was not a marriage. It was a breeding protocol with a religious name attached to it. And the protocol came with enforcement. A woman's primary duty was to produce healthy sons. If she succeeded, she gained status. Her position in Spartan society solidified. She could own property, manage estates, and speak with the authority that came from having delivered what the state demanded. But if she failed, the consequences were severe and systematic. A woman who did not produce children was treated as defective. Aristotle, who studied Sparta's social structure extensively, noted that childless women occupied the lowest rung of free female society, below war widows, below mothers of fallen soldiers, below women whose sons had distinguished themselves in battle. Childlessness was not viewed as misfortune. It was viewed as failure, and Sparta punished failure reflexively whether it occurred on the battlefield or in the home. If a husband was judged unable to produce children, the state intervened directly. Plutarch describes a practice where husbands were expected to lend their wives to other men, specifically men judged to be physically superior, so that the resulting offspring would be stronger. This was not presented as choice. It was presented as civic duty. Xenophon confirms this arrangement, adding that Lycurgus believed children belonged to the state rather than to individual families, and therefore it was the state's right to determine which pairings would produce the best results. The woman's feelings about being handed to a stranger were not part of the calculation. Her body was infrastructure. Her womb was public property. Her preferences were irrelevant noise in a system that had no use for individual desire. The helots were not slaves in the way most people understand the word. In Athens, a slave was private property, owned by an individual master, bought and sold on the open market, with a status that was degrading but at least legally defined. A helot was something worse. Helots were owned by the state, not by any individual Spartan, but by Sparta itself. This meant that no single person was responsible for their treatment. No single master could decide to be merciful. The entire apparatus of the state bore down on them collectively, and the state had no capacity for mercy because mercy was a weakness, and Sparta punished weakness above all things. The helots were the descendants of the Messenians, the people Sparta had conquered centuries earlier and enslaved as a population. They worked the land that fed Sparta. They built the infrastructure that housed Sparta. They performed every form of manual labor that Spartan citizens refused to do because Spartan citizens did nothing but train for war. Without the helots, the entire system collapsed. The soldiers could not train if no one grew their food. The women could not manage estates if no one did the physical work. The Agoge could not function if no one maintained the barracks and prepared the meager rations. Sparta needed the helots more than it needed anything else, and Sparta repaid that dependence with terror. Every autumn, the ephors, the 5 annually elected magistrates who held executive power in Sparta, performed a ritual that tells you everything about the helot condition. They formally declared war on the helots. This was not symbolic. It was a legal mechanism with devastating practical consequences. By declaring the helots an enemy at war, the ephors made it legal for any Spartan citizen to kill any helot at any time for any reason without facing charges of murder. You cannot murder an enemy combatant. You can only kill him. And the helots were permanently designated as enemy combatants living inside Spartan borders, working Spartan fields, raising Spartan food, and sleeping every night with the knowledge that any Spartan who chose to end their life could do so as casually as swatting a fly. Myron of Priene, a historian whose work survives in fragments, describes specific humiliations designed to remind helots of their status every single day. They were forced to wear caps made of dog skin, a symbol of servitude visible to everyone at all times. They were required to receive a fixed number of beatings each year, regardless of their behavior. Not punishment for wrongdoing, punishment for existing. The beatings were scheduled, administered whether the helot had done anything wrong or not. Their purpose was not discipline. Their purpose was degradation. The annual beating told every helot the same thing. You are beaten not because of what you did, but because of what you are. Your pain is not a consequence, it is a condition. Athenaeus records another practice designed to weaponize helots' suffering for educational purposes. Helots were forced to drink large quantities of unmixed wine that had not been diluted with water as was customary throughout the Greek world. Unmixed wine was considered barbaric, dangerous, the drink of people without self-control. The helots were made to drink it until they were visibly intoxicated. Then they were paraded before young Spartan boys in the Agoge as living demonstrations of what degradation looked like. Look at them, the lesson said. This is what happens to people who lack discipline. This is what you will become if you fail. The helots were not just slaves, they were teaching materials, their humiliation was curriculum. Thucydides, the most rigorous historian of the ancient Greek world, records an incident that reveals the true depth of Spartan cruelty toward helots. During the Peloponnesian War, Sparta needed additional soldiers and offered freedom to any helot who had demonstrated exceptional bravery in combat. 2,000 helots came forward. They were crowned with garlands and led to temples as if they were being honored. Then they disappeared. Every single one, 2,000 men who had been promised freedom, simply vanished. Thucydides states plainly that no one ever knew what became of them, but the implication is clear. Sparta had identified the 2,000 bravest and most capable helots and eliminated them, not despite their courage, but because of it. A brave helot was a dangerous helot. A helot who could fight was a helot who might lead a revolt. The promise of freedom was a trap, designed to make the strongest helots reveal themselves so they could be destroyed. If the annual declaration of war made killing helots legal, the Crypteia made it a graduation requirement. This was Sparta's most closely guarded institution, a practice so disturbing that even ancient writers who admired Sparta struggled to defend it. Plutarch describes it with visible discomfort. Aristotle condemned it outright, calling it a disgrace to the state that practiced it. Modern historians have compared it to state-sponsored terrorism. None of these descriptions are exaggerations. The Crypteia functioned as the final test for the most promising graduates of the Agoge. Young Spartan men, typically around 18 or 20 years old, were selected by the ephors and given a single piece of equipment, a knife. They were sent into the countryside alone. Their instructions were straightforward. Hide during the day, move at night, find helots, kill them. Not helots who had committed crimes, not helots who were planning revolt, not helots who had done anything at all to deserve death. Simply helots, preferably the strongest ones, the tallest, the most capable, the ones who walked with too much confidence, the ones whose physical condition suggested they might be dangerous if they ever organized. The Crypteia was a culling program, disguised as a military exercise. It targeted not guilt, but potential. The young Spartans hid in ditches, behind walls, in the scrub brush that covered the hillsides of Laconia. They waited until dark. They watched the roads, the fields, the isolated farmsteads where helot families lived, and when they found a target, they killed silently and moved on. Plutarch records that they operated for extended periods, days or weeks at a time, surviving on stolen food, sleeping in the open, hunting human beings the way other soldiers hunted game. The effect on the helot population was exactly what Sparta intended: permanent terror. You could not predict when the Crypteia would come. You could not know which of your neighbors or family members would be selected for killing. You could not defend yourself because helots were forbidden from possessing weapons. You could not flee because helots were forbidden from leaving their assigned territory. You went to sleep every night knowing that somewhere in the darkness outside your home, a young man with a knife and a mandate from the state might be watching, waiting, deciding whether you looked strong enough to be dangerous. Helot women on isolated farmsteads were particularly vulnerable. When their husbands and sons worked distant fields or were sent to serve as baggage carriers for the Spartan army on campaign, the women were left alone. The ancient sources do not describe in explicit detail what happened to helot women encountered by young men operating under the Crypteia with no oversight, no accountability, and total legal immunity. They do not need to. The implications are clear enough that Plutarch, who wrote detailed accounts of every other Spartan practice, chose to leave this particular subject in silence. And Plutarch's silence on a topic he normally addressed with thoroughness tells you more than any description could. The Crypteia was not a secret in Sparta. Everyone knew it existed. That was the point. Its power came not just from the killings themselves, but from the knowledge that the killings could happen at any time to anyone. A helot who grew too strong was a target. A helot who showed leadership was a target. A helot who simply drew attention by being visibly healthy or visibly confident was a target. The safest strategy for a helot was to appear weak, broken, incapable, to make yourself look like someone not worth killing. The Crypteia did not just eliminate potential rebel leaders. It conditioned the entire helot population to perform helplessness as a survival strategy, to shrink, to cower, to ensure that their bodies and their behavior communicated submission so total that no passing Spartan youth would consider them worth the effort of a knife stroke. This is what Sparta built, not just a military state, a terror state, a society where punishment operated at every level simultaneously. Infants punished for being born imperfect. Boys punished for showing pain. Women punished for failing to produce soldiers. Mothers punished for loving their children. And beneath all of it, an entire enslaved population punished simply for existing, terrorized into permanent submission by a system so comprehensive that resistance was not just dangerous, but psychologically impossible. Consider what you have learned so far, a society that inspected its newborns and discarded the imperfect, that took children from their mothers at 7 and starved and beat them for 2 decades, that whipped boys to death at a public altar while their parents watched, that shaved brides' heads and left them in dark rooms. That punished women for grieving, for being childless, for producing daughters instead of sons, that enslaved an entire population and declared war on them annually so killing them would be legal, that sent its best young men into the countryside to hunt human beings in the dark. And every one of these practices was not hidden, not secret, not carried out by rogue elements operating outside the system. Every one of these practices was the system, official policy, sacred tradition, the law of Lycurgus, upheld for centuries, celebrated by Spartans as the foundation of their superiority. This raises a question that historians have debated since antiquity. How does a society reach this point? How do human beings build a civilization where torturing children is education, where terrorizing slaves is governance, where stripping women of autonomy is liberation? Was Sparta uniquely cruel, or was it simply more honest than other ancient civilizations about what maintaining power actually required? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because what you are about to hear next complicates the answer in ways you might not expect. The system that Sparta built to make itself invincible is the same system that destroyed it from within. The irony of Sparta's punishment system is that it worked exactly as designed, and that is precisely why it failed. Every institution Sparta created to produce perfect soldiers also reduced the number of Spartans available to be soldiers. The math was catastrophic, and it was built into the foundation. Start with the newborn inspections. Every child rejected at the Lesh was a future soldier eliminated before he could serve. Modern estimates of rejection rates vary, but even a conservative figure of 10% means that Sparta was voluntarily discarding 1 in 10 potential warriors every generation. In a state with a small citizen population already vastly outnumbered by its enslaved workforce, every lost birth mattered. But Sparta could not stop the inspections without admitting that its founding principle, that only the physically perfect deserved to live, was negotiable, and in Sparta, nothing was negotiable. The Agoge compounded the losses. Boys died during training. They died during the diamastigosis. They died from exposure during winter. They died from starvation when the deliberate food deprivation went too far. They died in the organized fights that supervisors encouraged to become as violent as possible. Each death was framed as proof that the dead boy had been too weak to deserve survival, which meant the system was working. But each death was also one fewer soldier in a military that could not afford to lose a single man. The battlefield losses were even more devastating because Sparta's punishment culture ensured they would be maximized. Retreat was punished so severely through the Trisante system that Spartan soldiers chose death over withdrawal, even when tactical retreat would have preserved forces for future battles. A Spartan man who survived a lost battle by retreating faced a fate worse than the battlefield. He was branded a Trisantes, a trembler. His punishment was not execution. Execution would have been mercy. His punishment was life. The Trisantes had half his beard forcibly shaved, leaving the other half grown, so that his face itself announced his shame to everyone who saw him. He was forbidden from public spaces. The agora, the gymnasia, the communal mess halls where Spartan men ate together every evening, all closed to him. No citizen could speak to him. No woman could associate with him. If he encountered a Spartan woman in the street, she was not merely permitted but expected to strike him, to spit at him, to verbally destroy him in front of anyone within earshot. His family carried his shame. His children inherited his disgrace. His name became a curse used to frighten boys in the Agoge into absolute obedience. Herodotus tells the story of Aristodemus, and it is perhaps the clearest illustration of how Spartan punishment consumed the very men it was designed to protect. Aristodemus was one of 300 Spartans selected to defend the pass at Thermopylae against the Persian invasion of 480 before the Common Era. Before the final battle, Aristodemus and one other soldier, a man named Eurytus, were both struck with a severe eye infection that left them nearly blind. King Leonidas sent them to the rear to recover. When the Persians encircled the pass and the final stand became inevitable, Eurytus ordered his helot attendant to guide him back to the battle line. Blind, stumbling, unable to see the enemy he was fighting, Eurytus returned to the pass and died with the rest of the 300. Aristodemus did not. He remained in the rear, as Leonidas had ordered. He survived. For this, Sparta destroyed him. Not the Persians, not the enemy, his own city. Aristodemus returned to Sparta and was immediately branded a Trisontes. The fact that his king had personally ordered him to withdraw meant nothing. The fact that he had been physically incapable of fighting meant nothing. The only fact that mattered was that 300 men had died, and he had not. Every door in Sparta closed to him, every face turned away. Women crossed the street to avoid contamination by his presence. He lived in a silence more absolute than any prison cell could impose because, at least in a cell, someone must bring you food. In Sparta, the Trisontes had to endure the presence of thousands of people who all acted as though he did not exist. Aristodemus endured this for almost a year. Then the Battle of Crypteia came, the decisive engagement where the combined Greek forces would face the Persian army for the final time. Aristodemus was permitted to fight. Herodotus describes what happened next. Aristodemus broke ranks. He charged into the Persian lines alone, fighting with what every witness described as suicidal fury. He did not fight to win. He fought to die. And he succeeded. Aristodemus was killed in the battle, having fought with more visible courage than any other Spartan on the field. The Spartans refused to honor him. He had fought bravely, yes. He had died on the battlefield, yes. But the Spartans ruled that his courage was not true courage. It was desperation. He had not fought bravely because he was brave. He had fought recklessly because he wanted to escape his shame. And a man who fights to die is not a warrior. He is a suicide, seeking a dignified exit. His name was not added to the honors list. His family received no recognition. The message to every other Spartan was absolute. Once you are branded a coward, nothing you do will redeem you, not even dying. This was the logic that bled Sparta dry. The bravest soldiers died because retreat was unthinkable. The survivors were destroyed socially, which meant they either sought death in the next battle or lived as warnings that produced even more reckless bravery in others. The punishment system that was supposed to create fearless warriors instead created a military that could not preserve its own manpower. Every generation sent its best men to die and then punished anyone who survived. By the Battle of Leuctra in 371 before the Common Era, the consequences were undeniable. Sparta faced the Theban army under Epaminondas with approximately 1,000 full Spartiates. 1,000. A century earlier, Sparta had fielded 8,000. The population had collapsed by nearly 90% in 100 years. The eugenics program that rejected imperfect babies, the Agoge that killed boys during training, the battlefield culture that made survival shameful, the punishment of cowards that eliminated survivors from the breeding population, all of it had combined into a demographic catastrophe that no military training could overcome. Sparta's army was still the best-trained fighting force in Greece. There simply were not enough of them left to matter. Aristotle, writing a generation after Leuctra, performed what might be called an autopsy of a still-living patient. He examined Sparta's institutions with clinical precision and identified the exact mechanisms of self-destruction. His analysis in the politics is devastating because it locates the cause of Sparta's decline not in military defeat, but in the punishment system itself. He began with women. Aristotle observed that Spartan women had accumulated enormous wealth. By the 4th century before the Common Era, women controlled roughly 2/5 of all land in Sparta. This was not empowerment. It was mathematics. So many men had died in battle, generation after generation, that property concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Widows inherited from husbands. Daughters inherited when there were no surviving sons. Mothers outlived multiple children and accumulated their estates. The result was an oligarchy of wealthy women presiding over a shrinking pool of male citizens who could no longer field an army large enough to defend the territory those women owned. Aristotle was blunt about the consequence. The state that had punished women for failing to produce soldiers had created conditions where producing soldiers was increasingly impossible. The remaining Spartan men could not afford the contributions to the communal mess halls that were required for full citizenship. If you could not pay your share at the syssitia, the nightly communal meal, you lost your status as a Spartiate. You became one of the inferiors, stripped of political rights and military standing. The punishment system had always been binary. You were either a full Spartan or you were nothing. Now, the economics of demographic collapse were pushing more and more men below the line, and every man who fell took his potential sons with him. The helot system, that foundation of terror on which everything rested, began to crack under the same pressures. Fewer Spartan soldiers meant fewer men available to suppress helot resistance. The Crypteia continued, but young men sent to murder helots in the darkness were now being drawn from a pool so small that every casualty was catastrophic. When Epaminondas invaded Laconia after his victory at Leuctra, he did something no general had accomplished in centuries. He liberated the Messenian helots. The enslaved population that Sparta had terrorized for over 300 years walked free. Messenia became an independent state with its own walls and its own army, positioned permanently on Sparta's western border as a reminder of everything the punishment system had failed to prevent. Sparta did not die in a single dramatic collapse. It diminished. It shrank year by year, generation by generation, the way a fire shrinks when there is nothing left to burn. The institutions remained. The Agoge continued to operate. The dimastagosis at the altar of Artemis Orthia still drew blood from boys who endured the whip in silence, but the substance drained away while the rituals persisted. Sparta became a performance of itself, a city reenacting its own traditions for an audience rather than living them as necessity. The Romans understood this. When they absorbed Greece into their empire, they treated Sparta as a curiosity rather than a threat. They built the amphitheater around the altar of Artemis Orthia and sold tickets to watch the whipping ceremony. Roman tourists traveled to Laconia the way modern tourists visit historical theme parks, to experience a simulation of something that once had real power but now existed only as spectacle. Cicero watched boys being whipped and wrote about it as an intellectual exercise. Plutarch documented Spartan customs the way an anthropologist documents the rituals of a vanished civilization. By their time, the most militarized society in ancient history had become entertainment. The city that had punished weakness more severely than any civilization before or since had been undone by its own severity. The machine designed to produce invincible warriors had consumed its raw materials faster than they could be replenished, and then kept running on empty, grinding nothing, until there was nothing left to grind. Now, let me take you back to where we began, to Agiatis, to the mountain, to the child with the twisted foot who was carried away from his mother on the third day of his life. Agiatis did what every Spartan woman in her position was required to do. She mourned in silence, inside walls where no one could see her face, and then she stopped mourning. She returned to the gymnasium. She exercised with the other women. She ate the black broth at the communal table and spoke the expected words about duty and the wisdom of the elders. She performed recovery the way Sparta demanded it be performed, not as a process of grief but as a demonstration of obedience. Within weeks, she was expected to conceive again. Her husband was permitted to visit her in the dark, briefly, silently, and then return to his barracks before dawn. The state required another attempt, another product. Another body to be inspected at the lesh by old men who would stretch its limbs and test its cry and determine whether this one was worth keeping. If the next child passed inspection, the previous loss was erased. Not forgiven, not healed, erased, as if it had never happened. No Spartan would mention the rejected child. No record of his existence would survive. He had failed the first test, the state administered, and therefore he had never truly existed as a Spartan. His mother was permitted to continue her life as though she had simply been delayed, the way a farmer might lose a season's crop to weather and begin again the following spring. If the next child also failed, or if Agiatis could not conceive again, the silence around her would thicken into something more deliberate. The other women would distance themselves. Invitations to religious ceremonies would stop arriving. Her status would erode quietly, invisibly, like stone worn smooth by water, until one day she would realize she had become what Sparta feared most: useless. A woman who consumed resources without producing the only thing that justified her consumption. She would not be executed. She would not be exiled. She would simply cease to matter, which in a community as small and as tightly monitored as Sparta was a death sentence delivered in slow motion. Some women in this position were reassigned. Their husbands, with the approval of the ephors, would transfer breeding rights to another man judged more likely to produce healthy offspring. Plutarch frames this as a reasonable arrangement. Xenophon frames it as civic responsibility. Neither writer mentions what the woman thought about being handed to a stranger, because neither writer considered her thoughts relevant to the discussion. This was the life the system built. A woman standing at the intersection of every punishment Sparta had devised. Punished if her child was imperfect. Punished if she grieved. Punished if she could not conceive. Punished if she produced daughters. Punished if her sons showed cowardice. Punished not through violence, which at least acknowledges the existence of the person being struck, but through erasure, which denies that the person was ever there at all. Agiatis is not a name that survives in the historical record the way Leonidas or Gorgo survive. She is a composite, drawn from the documented experiences of thousands of Spartan women whose individual stories were never recorded because Sparta did not consider individual women worthy of recording. But she is no less real for being unnamed. She is every woman who stood against a wall while strangers evaluated her child. Every woman who watched a small bundle being carried toward a mountain. Every woman who swallowed her grief because the alternative was social destruction. Every woman who understood, in the quiet hours between sunset and the darkness when her husband might or might not arrive, that the system she had been taught to celebrate as the pinnacle of civilization was a machine that used her body as raw material and discarded what it could not use. The ruins of ancient Sparta are not impressive. If you travel to the Eurotas Valley today expecting the grandeur of Athens or the imposing walls of Mycenae, you will be disappointed. There is no Parthenon, no monumental gate, no towering fortification preserved across millennia. There are scattered stones, foundation outlines and dry grass, a few columns standing like broken teeth against the sky. The theater is modest. The temple remains are fragmentary. The city that terrorized the ancient world for 3 centuries left behind almost nothing worth photographing. This is not an accident of time and erosion. This is the final expression of everything Sparta was. A city that built no walls because it considered walls a sign of weakness. A city that constructed no great monuments because beauty was a distraction from discipline. A city that produced almost no literature, no philosophy, no art, because every resource, human and material, was fed into the single purpose of military production. Sparta did not leave ruins, because Sparta did not build things meant to last. It built people meant to fight and die, and when those people were gone, there was nothing left. The altar of Artemis Orthia still exists, partially excavated, surrounded by the stone seats the Romans built for tourists who came to watch boys bleed. The cowardice chasm on Taygetus still opens in the rock face, a dark mouth in the mountainside, where bones have rested for over 2,000 years. The Eurotas still flows through the valley where Agoge boys pulled reeds with bare hands in winter to make their beds. The landscape remembers what the buildings do not. And what the landscape remembers is this: a civilization that turned punishment into its founding principle, that took the natural human instinct to protect children and inverted it into a system for discarding them, that took the bond between mother and child and made it a liability punishable by social death, that took an entire conquered population and reduced them to livestock terrorized by teenagers with knives in the dark, that took its own young men and broke them so thoroughly that dying in battle became preferable to living with the consequences of survival. Sparta proved something that no other ancient civilization demonstrated so completely. A society can be organized entirely around punishment. It can function. It can dominate its neighbors. It can produce soldiers of extraordinary quality and discipline. It can endure for centuries. And it will still destroy itself. Because a system that punishes everything eventually punishes its own ability to continue existing. The infants rejected at birth were soldiers who never fought. The boys killed in training were men who never bred. The warriors who chose death over retreat were fathers who never raised sons. The cowards destroyed socially were citizens removed from the gene pool by shame rather than by enemy spears. Each punishment, individually rational within Sparta's logic, collectively amounted to a civilization methodically eliminating itself one generation at a time. The ancient Greeks had a word for it: oliganthropia, a shortage of men. By the time Sparta's enemies identified this weakness and exploited it, the damage was irreversible. The system had eaten its own. If you found this deep dive into history's most systematic machinery of human control compelling, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and that notification bell so you do not miss the stories that mainstream history refuses to tell. Share this video with anyone who thinks they know what Sparta was really like, because I guarantee what they learned in school is less than half the truth. Drop a comment telling me which part of Sparta's system disturbed you most: the inspection of newborns, the diamastigoses, the Crypteia, or the quiet destruction of women who failed to produce what the state demanded. And tell me where in the world you are watching from, because these stories deserve to reach every corner of the planet. But Sparta was not the only civilization that perfected the art of punishing its own people. There is another empire, older and larger, whose methods of controlling women made even the Spartans look restrained. An empire that turned punishment into a science practiced behind walls so thick that the screams of its victims never reached the outside world. That story is waiting for you right now. Click the video on your screen and discover what history buried next.